Hey there, sleepless rabble. Let me take over for a while. You know Sweeney Todd, right? The barber with the meat pies. Well, Germany had its own version. Only here's the twist. Instead of pies, there were sausages, allegedly. And instead of razors, he used his teeth. Tonight, we're digging into a butcher of sorts, though he never swung a cleaver in his life. A case of bones in the river, a police force fumbling in the dark, and a killer who turned a starving city into his hunting ground. We'll pull it apart from A to Z. So if you enjoy your bedtime stories with a side of true crime, hit like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments, which dark figure should we put under the microscope next? This is Napmax Stories, and you're listening to The Vampire of Hanover, Fritz Haarmann. It began, as these things often do, with something small and indecent drifting where decent people preferred not to look. May 1924, the river line running green and indifferent past bridges that creaked under the weight of the commuters and gossip. A boy on the bank thought he'd found a pale, round stone. He kicked it once, twice, and then stopped because stones don't have teeth. The police were called, reluctantly. There are only so many kinds of paperwork a city can bear before lunch. A skull went into a sack, then another. Ribs in a bundle of reeds. A femur snagged on a submerged bicycle like punctuation snagging on a bad sentence. By the end of the week, the river wasn't a river anymore. It was a confession. At first, Hanover tried the usual stories. War dead, perhaps. The nation was still shedding bones the way trees shed leaves. Casual, seasonal, inevitable. But the war's remains didn't usually come neat and clean, their surfaces polished by short, waterlogged journeys. These bones were fresh in a way that made morgue attendants go quiet and press their lips together like men trying not to vomit. The city's respectable class held handkerchiefs to their faces and declared themselves shocked. Privately, they were also entertained. Horror, properly arranged, is a kind of theatre, and Hanover loved a matinee. The papers understood this perfectly. Butcher at large, screamed type that hadn't been this excited since an election. River of bones, monster in our midst, who is taking our sons? The printers set extra copies. The newsboys practiced the right amount of tremble in their voices. The lane's edge became a promenade. Mothers clutched children. Men pretended they were there to help, not to stare. Everyone speculated about meat. In a hungry city, you always eventually arrive at meat. Downstream, constables paced in their stiff uniforms, dragging the shallows with hooks borrowed from a warehouse. Upstream, two fishermen swore they'd seen a man dumping sacks at night. They were not reliable witnesses, chiefly because they were fishermen and it was night, but also because everyone in Hanover had begun to see sacks at night. Still, the evidence mounted in the way evidence likes to mount. Steadily, insistently, without regard for anyone's timetable. Bones trundled into the morgue by the crate. Tags bloomed like paper flowers. Numbers replaced names because numbers are easier to file than grief. This was not the city's first brush with ugliness. The 1920s in Hanover smelled of coal smoke and sour cabbage, of boiled linen, of the relentless thrift of people who had run out of both money and illusions. Children learned early that you didn't ask what was in the sausage, and adults learned not to answer. The black market had its own map, its own passwords, its own quiet rules about who ate and who watched others eat. If something darker moved through those rules, well, what didn't? You could dismiss a missing boy as a runaway because that made the world make sense. He'd reappear when the weather warmed, or he wouldn't. And either way, there were dishes to wash and a rent to negotiate with a landlord who smelled of onions and patience lost. But the river refused to participate in that comforting story. The river pushed. Evidence has that habit. It floats back at you when you try to drown it. Bits of clothing clung to roots. Teeth clinked against tin bowls as if insisting on their own inventory. The city's nervous system, its rumour mills, its beer halls, its sickly gossip, lit up. People remembered boys they hadn't seen. A schoolmaster shuffled through attendance books with a frown like a paper cut. A woman at the station swore she'd watched a stocky man in a decent coat take a lad by the elbow, gentle, practiced, and steer him into the crowd like a shepherd returning a stray. No one remembered the boy's name. Everyone remembered the coat. By the third week, even the police stopped saying coincidence. A clerk with good handwriting spread files across a long table and tried to teach the chaos to dance in rows. Names, heights, scars. Last seen at... The pile kept growing until the table became an accusation. Senior men stood around it with the air of people who'd rather be anywhere else. It wasn't that they didn't care. Caring was assumed, like shoes. It was that caring didn't help you when the river delivered a new skull in the morning, and a counsellor delivered a new budget complaint in the afternoon. Caring didn't conjure microscopes or modern chemistry. Caring didn't turn rumours into witnesses. And yet, something shifted. The city's gaze, usually trained forward on survival, swiveled sideways. People began to watch one another, to count heads twice, to walk faster after dark. Butchers received jokes that were not jokes. Landladies inspected stains with an expertise they never hoped to acquire. The liner, thoroughly sick of her cargo, slowed and went quiet as if holding her breath. What made this different from 100 other sad, hungry tragedies was the understanding, filthy, precise, that someone was doing this now. Not in a past battle or a faraway field, but here, under the bridges that echoed with tram bells and arguments. The bones had dates written in their smoothness. They were the present tense. By the end of June, a line had been crossed that the city could no longer back away from. A detective, tired and late, sat in the morgue and looked at the neatly arranged skulls, each tagged with a number that sounded like a lie. He lit a cigarette with hands that shook slightly, and he said to the attendant, "All right, enough. We hunt." The attendant, who had spent 3 weeks hosing silence off concrete, nodded once. The river had spoken in the only language she had left. The next sentences would be written on blotting paper and in ash, in cramped handwriting and in boot leather. Whatever this thing was, whoever he was, the lean had dragged him halfway into daylight. The rest of him would have to be pried loose by men with pencils and questions, and not nearly enough sleep. But let us go inside headquarters, into the smoke, the ledgers, the fragile rituals of order, where a table of skulls and a stack of missing boys forced the police to admit the monster they were hunting might already be sitting in their files. Hanover in the 1920s was the kind of place where despair hung heavier than the smoke from factory chimneys. The war had stripped it bare, inflation had finished the job, and the city wore poverty like a second skin. You didn't need a detective to tell you who was struggling. You could hear it in the growl of empty stomachs and see it in the eyes of children selling matches on the street corner. The official food rations were laughable if you had the sense of humour for it. Sausages bulged with mystery ingredients, and no one asked questions because asking meant you might lose your appetite, or worse, your place in line. Flour was stretched with sawdust, coffee replaced with a roasted barley. Hanover lived on substitutes, and if something tasted vaguely like meat, you shut your mouth, chewed, and prayed it wasn't the neighbour's dog. Or something even less mentionable, The central station became the city's theatre of hunger. It was where everything intersected: commuters, black marketeers, drifters, soldiers without wars, and, most crucially, boys. Too many boys, with faces sharp from malnutrition and eyes that flicked between hope and fear. They haunted the platforms, offering errands, favors, or whatever else survival demanded. To a casual traveler, they were just background noise. To someone like Haarmann, they were an all-you-can-eat buffet served under flickering gaslight. And the police? Oh, they saw it too. Vice squads would march through the station, puffed up like pigeons, shooing boys into side streets only for them to return an hour later. Arrests were made, paperwork filled out, and then, miraculously, the same faces reappeared the next week. Thinner, but not gone. The city was a revolving door for desperation. If Hanover had been a play, the script would have been rewritten daily, but the actors remained the same. Officials pretending to control, and the vulnerable pretending they had choices. It was a city permanently off balance. You could feel it in the markets, where housewives haggled with a sharpness born of survival, and traders sold tins with labels peeled off, because mystery stew always fetched a better price. You could feel it in the beer halls, where unemployed men laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. And you could feel it in the whispers, because everyone knew boys were disappearing. They just didn't want to dwell on it too long. Dwelling didn't fill the stomach. Dwelling didn't pay the rent. And here's the cruel irony. Hanover had trained itself to look away long before Haarmann perfected the art of disappearing boys. The city was already desensitized. It had lived through hunger riots, soldiers marching home with haunted stares, neighbors betraying neighbors over a handful of coal. What's one more missing face? When survival demands selective blindness, that blindness gave Haarmann cover. He didn't need to hide behind locked doors. He hid in plain sight, camouflaged by the sheer weight of misery all around him. Who would look twice at a stocky man leading a boy away from the station? Plenty of men did that. Some of them were policemen. Some of them were worse. Hanover's tragedy was that you couldn't tell the difference anymore. The streets, the soup kitchens, the overcrowded hostels, they all hummed with the same dull energy. Make it through the day, don't ask too many questions, and never, ever look too closely at the meat. If Sweeney Todd had thrived in Victorian London's gloom, Haarmann had Hanover's hunger on his side. His genius wasn't subtlety, it was timing. He killed in a city that was already half dead. And so Hanover teetered, balanced on rumours and resignation, waiting for someone, anyone, to connect the dots between the missing and the bones in the river. But until then, the city itself was his greatest accomplice. Blind, hungry, and just relieved it wasn't their child washing up on the lane's banks. So now you have an idea of just how grim the backdrop was. But wait until you meet the man who turned it into his personal hunting ground. Before he was a headline, Fritz Haarmann was a familiar silhouette. Stocky, compact, with thinning hair and that I belong here posture you usually find on ticket inspectors and petty bureaucrats. He had the kind of face you forget and the kind of voice you obey. Steady, practical, faintly irritated by your existence. If a city could invent the perfect shepherd for strays, it would look a lot like him. Ordinary enough to blend in, official enough to hush questions, hungry enough to make use of both. His life up to this point read like a ledger of almosts. Almost a soldier, almost a shopman, almost respectable. The drift into small-time crime felt less like a fall than a nudge. Pilfered goods, forged slips, doors eased open with the gentlest insistence. Nothing grand, just the sort of offences that turn policemen into regulars and judges into acquaintances. It taught him two useful lessons. First, rules are elastic if you learn who stretches them. Second, a polite tone is cheaper than bail. Hanover, ever practical, discovered he could be useful. He knew the station's rhythms the way a street musician knows a melody. When the crowds thinned, which platforms coughed up drifters, how the morning inspectors differed from the night ones. He knew the boys who lived by the hour, apprentices who had slipped their masters, runaways who discovered freedom comes with an empty stomach. The shy ones, the cocky ones, the ones who said yes too quickly just to stop shivering. He learned names, then learned that names are optional if you have the right smile. Somewhere in that education, he acquired a costume. Not a real uniform, not quite, but the posture of authority. Move along, papers, that way. Delivered with the weary competence of someone who has done this 1,000 times. He escorted drunk men off platforms, shooed teenagers when the wrong eyes were watching, chatted with constables as if they were colleagues. The badge he flashed was more attitude than metal, but attitude goes a long way if no one cares to check. Neighbours described him in contradictions that fit together too well. Helpful, quarrelsome, tidy, noisy, generous with cigarettes, stingy with patience. He could be charming in a way that felt like relief. Firm voice, quick decisions, a meal materializing when you were too proud to ask. He could also swing to fury without warning, as if someone had tripped a spring you couldn't see. The story varied depending on who told it, but the chorus stayed the same. He was there. At the station, on the stairs, in the doorway with a key already turning. Always there. If you want to understand why boys followed him, forget the gore and remember the weather. Picture a platform after midnight. Rain that doesn't fall so much as cling, air the temperature of a damp handshake, lamps that turn faces into coins. A man steps in, solid coat, steady voice, the promise of 4 walls and a plate. Authority is the oldest lullaby. Hungry children hear it and feel briefly, blessedly, horizontal. He didn't need to stalk. He recruited. To the police, this was convenient. Every city keeps a short list of people who know what respectable people pretend not to. He was on it. He pointed out thieves, tipped off raids, translated the station's gossip into tidy notes. He rode along on the occasional sweep, looking for all the world, like a constable whose uniform had wandered off. When complaints arrived about a rough man hustling boys, he could be found assisting the response. It is a very modern trick. Be close enough to the system that the system sees its own reflection instead of your shadow. He had companions too. Lovers who came and went with the weather. Friends who stayed long enough to borrow clothes that didn't belong to them. Hangers-on who discovered that his hospitality had a curfew and a cost. Some saw the temper and stepped back. Others saw the food and stepped forward. Quite a few understood what was happening only in the way the body understands a fever. Too late and without language. The nickname that would fix him in memory arrived only after the method leaked out. Vampire of Hanover. It sounds theatrical until you picture the practical version. Not capes and castles, but a bite at the throat delivered by a man whose hands were already on your shoulders. Not velvet-lined coffins, but a bed in a stuffy room you were grateful for until you weren't. The legend chooses melodrama. The reality chooses efficiency. And the police? They kept 2 files in the same drawer. Useful and suspect, printed on opposite sides of the same paper. You can forgive them a little if you remember the era. Too few men, too many crises, a laboratory that could tell you whether a stain was organic and then go bashfully quiet. When an informant walks like a policeman and talks like a neighbour, suspicion must fight for oxygen. Besides, he had done them favours. Favours like debts bend vision. Haarmann understood that perfectly. He cultivated the sort of visibility that feels like transparency while revealing nothing. He appeared when officers appeared, vanished when they were gone, knew first names, remembered birthdays, lifted boxes, tutted at mischief. He lived inside the idea of helpful, and people defend their ideas long after the facts misbehave. None of this made him mythical. It made him practical. He was, infuriatingly, a local solution to local problems. A man who could make disorder look briefly managed. That he also manufactured a more intimate kind of disorder behind his door only completes the circle. The mask wasn't elaborate. It didn't need to be. The city had done half the work. Hunger blurs edges, routine blinds, and a bad-shaped shadow covers a multitude of sins. So when his name started echoing a little too often in witness statements, stocky, thinning hair, that coat, that voice, the sound felt familiar rather than alarming. Familiarity is the city's favourite anaesthetic. You can spend months nodding to a neighbour and never notice the smell beneath the soup. You can share a bench with a predator and remember only that he gave you a cigarette when the rain came sideways. He didn't arrive with thunder. He accumulated, favour by favour, hour by hour, until the shape of him filled the room. And if the room sometimes shook with sudden noise, well, old buildings do that. If boys arrived and did not reappear, well, boys wander. If the river spoke, well, rivers are dramatic. Hanover could rationalise anything, right up to the moment it couldn't. Call him a vampire if you like. It is cleaner than the truth. The truth is a man who learned to look like help long enough to become harm. Who learned the timetables of a city the way a butcher learns cuts. Who discovered that the best hiding place was the space everyone glances at and never sees. He didn't need immortality. He had the station. He had the voice. He had the door. From the street, Haarmann's flat on Kellerstrasse looked like nothing much at all. Just another weary building among dozens, its plaster flaking like dry skin, its stairwell echoing with the familiar chorus of crying children, slammed doors, and neighbours fighting over coal deliveries. In Hanover's housing market, invisibility was an asset, and Fritz Haarmann, for all his flair at the station, lived in a room that seemed determined to disappear. Inside, the walls sweated damp in winter and baked in summer. The furniture was a mismatched collection of hand-me-downs. A bed with springs that groaned like an old drunk. A wardrobe too large for the space. A table with one leg shorter than the others. Curtains that never quite closed. Carpets that tried and failed to hide stains. It was the kind of room where you could imagine everything except comfort. Perfect, then, for what Haarmann had in mind. Neighbours whispered, because neighbours always do. They noticed noises in the night. Thuds, arguments, the scrape of furniture at impossible hours. They smelled odours that didn't fit. Not quite food, not quite waste. Something sour-sweet that clung to the hallway even after windows were thrown open. And yet, no one acted. In a building full of poverty, everyone learned to ignore what didn't belong to them. The rule was simple. Mind your own damp wallpaper, and your neighbours will mind theirs. Still, rumours spread. People gossiped about the endless stream of boys coming and going. Some stayed a night, some an hour, some not at all. Hans Granz, Haarmann's sometime lover and partner in crime, was seen wearing jackets that seemed suspiciously new, trousers that didn't fit quite right. When asked, he'd grin and shrug. Clothes circulate, don't they? In a city this poor second hand was everyone's first choice. Nobody asked too loudly where the first hand had gone. Every apartment has a rhythm. In Haarmann's, it was the rhythm of arrival and silence. A boy would follow him in, eager, reluctant, hungry, curious, and then nothing. The walls swallowed sound. The night went on. In the morning, neighbours might see Haarmann leaving, cheerful enough, sometimes with parcels, sometimes without. What they rarely saw was the boy leaving too. The police, for their part, had stepped into this room before. They'd searched it, glanced at the furniture, sniffed at the air, and noted nothing worth prosecuting. A few stains on the floor. Soup, insisted Haarmann. An odd smell. Bad drains. Boys' clothing in the wardrobe. Donations, surely. He even managed to joke with a grin that hovered just shy of charming. Well, if I had murdered someone, don't you think I'd have cleaned up better? The officers laughed, uncomfortable but relieved to move on. After all, he was their informant, wasn't he? Too useful to lock away, too familiar to suspect properly. It was here, in this shabby flat, that the reality diverged from the rumour. The stories about sausages would never be proven. Perhaps they were invented by a starving city eager to believe the worst. But the truth was grim enough without embellishment. Strangulation, throats bitten in a frenzy that gave him his nickname, bodies dismembered with practiced precision, all carried out within those damp, peeling walls while the city outside hummed on, oblivious. The irony of it all is almost theatrical. A man pretending to be a policeman, living in a building where everyone looked away, protected by the very force that should have stopped him. He didn't need a dungeon or a secret cellar. His killing ground was a rented flat with bad plumbing, sandwiched between families who chalked up every thud and stain to life in a cheap tenement. If Hanover's streets provided him with prey, then these four walls provided him with cover. And cover, in a city this hungry, was worth more than gold. The neighbours kept their silence, the police kept their informant, and Haarmann kept working, efficiently, invisibly, night after night, behind a door that looked no different from anyone else's. If the neighbours suspected anything, they didn't imagine this. The official files would later catalogue Haarmann's method in neat, bureaucratic handwriting, but no amount of tidy language could disguise the horror. His killings weren't elaborate. They weren't ritualistic. They were terrifyingly efficient. It began with trust. A boy on a station platform, cold, hungry, maybe drunk, maybe simply lost. Haarmann offered warmth. His room, a meal, a cigarette. The boys followed because what else was? There? Hanover had stripped them of options long before Haarmann appeared. For a night, at least, someone seemed to care. Someone offered a bed. But the bed was a trap. Haarmann's pattern, as far as anyone could reconstruct, was grimly straightforward. He would strangle his victims, often in a burst of sudden rage, sometimes after sex, sometimes without. What gave him his infamous nickname wasn't the strangling, but what came next. The bite. A violent tearing at the throat, as if some part of him couldn't resist acting out the monster the city would later paint him as. Not calculated, not staged for theatrics, just raw, impulsive brutality. The mark of teeth was his signature, carved into flesh that never had the chance to heal. That detail spread quickly once investigators uncovered it. Hanover, primed by hunger and horror, seized on the word vampire. And the nickname stuck because it fit too well. In a city where people already joke nervously about sausages and mystery meat, The idea of a man who not only killed, but drank was too grotesque to ignore. Never mind that there was little evidence he consumed blood in any significant way. The legend had more staying power than the facts. Vampires sell newspapers, stranglers don't. Still, the bite was real, and it was monstrous enough on its own. Pathologists later testified about crushed windpipes, ruptured vessels, the unmistakable impressions of human teeth. Each detail turned the courtroom into a theatre of gasps. What the papers didn't emphasize was the practical brutality. The killing was often over in minutes. The body swiftly dealt with in the cramped flat. The traces scrubbed away with an efficiency born of repetition. Repetition. That was the real horror. This wasn't an isolated frenzy, a single act of madness. It was a pattern, carried out again and again, almost industrial in its rhythm. A boy vanished, a bite, a body dismantled, bones in the lean, and then another, and another. The gruesome assembly line of one man, shielded by a city too distracted, too hungry, and too willing to look the other way. Neighbors who later testified remembered sounds, a sudden crash, a scream cut off too quickly, silence that seemed heavier than noise. They remembered Haarmann emerging the next morning, cheerful enough, carrying parcels wrapped in newspaper, nodding politely to anyone he passed. Some swore the parcels smelled of meat. Others convinced themselves they were imagining it, but no one asked. Not seriously. Who asks their neighbor if they've been butchering children in the night? Better to shrug, to gossip, to push the thought away. The police, too, had their near misses. More than once they entered his flat on suspicion of petty theft or illegal dealings. They saw stains on the floor, smelled the sour air, noticed boys' clothing that didn't fit him. Haarmann explained it all with a kind of weary humor. The stains, soup, the smell, bad drains, the clothes, second-hand sales, and every time the officers accepted it, because they wanted to, because the alternative was unthinkable, and because inconveniently he was their informant. The vampire walked among them not with fangs bared, but with a smirk and a helpful tip for the next raid. If you strip away the legend, what remains is worse. Not a gothic monster, but a man who discovered that violence could be casual, repeated, hidden in plain sight. He killed not in castles, but in tenement rooms. His coffins were the waters of the lane. His fangs were teeth no different from anyone else's. The press would later sensationalize, of course. Sketches of capes and gory fantasies filled columns, as if horror needed dressing up. But the true terror was its banality. The Vampire of Hanover was not an exotic figure from folklore. He was a man who looked ordinary enough to pass as a policeman, who lived in a shabby flat that smelled faintly wrong, who killed with the same rhythm others used to chop firewood. And perhaps that is why the city embraced the vampire story. Because the alternative, that a perfectly ordinary man could do this, again and again, with no one stopping him, was too much to bear. Better a monster in legend than a neighbor in reality. Behind the door of that small flat, in the hours when Hanover slept, the line between myth and man blurred. A bite to the throat, a body silenced, and a city that continued on, pretending not to hear. All these atrocities, carried out night after night, might sound like too much for one man to shoulder alone. And perhaps they were, because Fritz Haarmann, for all his efficiency, did not always act in isolation. He had companions, partners of convenience, partners of passion, and partners who were simply too greedy or too foolish to walk away. The most infamous of them was Hans Granz, Haarmann's on-and-off lover. If Haarmann was the predator, Granz was the scavenger, never quite doing the killing himself, but never questioning too hard where the stream of new clothing, shoes, and other valuables kept coming from. He was younger, handsome in a sly way, with an appetite for fine things that his own means could never provide. And Haarmann, for all his brutality, seemed desperate for his affection. It was a toxic pairing. One man who craved control, the other who craved luxury, both willing to overlook the screams in the night. Witnesses would later describe how Granz wore jackets far too big for him, trousers that had clearly belonged to someone else, shoes that seemed too new for his lifestyle. When asked, he would laugh it off. Gifts, trades, nothing unusual in a city drowning in second-hand goods. Hanover was a place where clothing had as many lives as cats. So who cared if a coat had switched owners overnight? But underneath the shrug lay a truth too grotesque to admit. Many of those garments came straight from Haarmann's victims. Neighbors noticed. They noticed the boys arriving, the clothes leaving, the way Granz and others treated the flat like a second-hand boutique. But suspicion needs courage, and courage was thin on the ground. Who wanted to accuse a man who seemed protected by the police? Who wanted to believe that a neighbor's jacket once belonged to a boy who was now bones at the bottom of the line? And then there were the other profiteers. Less notorious than Granz, but part of the same orbit. Dealers who bought clothing without asking questions. Lodgers who accepted food and drink without wondering too much about the source. Friends who took advantage of Haarmann's hospitality while politely ignoring the stains on the floor. They didn't wield the knife or bite the throat, but their silence was the currency he spent freely. Granz in particular pushed the boundaries. Some accounts suggest he encouraged Haarmann to kill more, especially when a boy wore clothes that caught his eye. Whether that's exaggeration or bitter hindsight, the fact remains. He stayed. He enjoyed the benefits, and Haarmann, smitten, tolerated him even when Granz mocked or humiliated him in public. For a man who controlled his victims with terrifying ease, Haarmann himself seemed strangely powerless in the orbit of this younger lover. The irony is cruel but fitting. The Vampire of Hanover, feared across the city, was also a man desperate for the approval of someone who saw him less as a partner than as a supplier. The hunter reduced to errand boy, fetching trophies not from shops, but from corpses. It was a dynamic that only deepened the tragedy. Boys didn't just die because Haarmann wanted them. Sometimes they died because Granz wanted a new coat. Later in the courtroom, Granz would deny, deflect, and finally confess just enough to save himself. He played the part of the hanger-on, the weak one, the boy led astray by a monster. And perhaps some of that was true. But monsters rarely thrive alone. They need shadows, accomplices, and the quiet nods of those who benefit from looking away. In Hanover, those nods were plentiful. And so the killings continued, not in secrecy, but in a strange half-light where neighbors whispered, profiteers smiled, and a lover strutted about in the clothes of the dead. If there is one rumor that has clung to the name Fritz Haarmann, like grease to butcher's paper, it is the sausages. And to be perfectly honest, the rumor makes a grotesque kind of sense. Hanover in the 1920s was starving. Meat was scarce, expensive, and often questionable, even when it came with a stamp. People bought whatever they could afford, and sausages were the easiest disguise. Grind it, spice it, stuff it in a casing. No one could tell the difference between pork, dog, or something darker. In that climate, the leap from bones in the river to meat on the table wasn't just sensationalism. It was almost logical. The whispers began with neighbors. They had long complained about the smell in Haarmann's flat, an odour that wasn't quite drains and wasn't quite soup. They saw him carry parcels wrapped in newspaper down the stairs, sometimes still warm. They noticed that despite his meager means, he always seemed to have meat to fry, meat to sell, meat to share. And in a city where mothers lined up for hours to buy gristle, this abundance stood out. When asked about it, Haarmann would grin and claim he had connections at the slaughterhouse, which, in its own twisted way, was true. The story spread. Haarmann was making sausage. Not pork sausage, not beef, but something far cheaper, far fresher, and far more horrifying. The missing boys weren't just dumped in the line, they were minced, spiced, and sold on the black market. Housewives whispered it in queues. Butchers laughed nervously when customers eyed their wares too closely. And more than a few families swore, after the trial, that they had once eaten a meal in Haarmann's flat, and suddenly remembered a taste they would never forget. Investigators, to their credit, looked into it. They searched the flat, the drains, the stove. They found bones, yes. Skulls, yes. But no sausage grinder, no meat hooks, no definitive proof. Still, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in a city eager for explanations. And when you have a killer disposing of bodies at industrial speed, the question becomes less, did he, and more, why wouldn't he? Consider the logistics. Haarmann killed at least 24 boys, perhaps more. Bones turned up in the river, but not all of them. Flesh has to go somewhere, and dustbins weren't exactly discreet. Selling meat, on the other hand, was both disposal and profit. The black market had no receipts, no questions asked. If someone raised an eyebrow about the taste, well, spice covers a multitude of sins. Some claimed they bought sausage from him directly. Others swore he sold to local vendors, who happily looked the other way. One particularly chilling account described neighbors enjoying a hearty stew Haarmann had prepared, only to gag years later when they remembered how proudly he'd served it. Whether those memories were genuine or embroidered by hindsight hardly matters. The rumour stuck because it fit the hunger of the city and the horror of the case. The courts, of course, preferred to keep things clinical. Murder was shocking enough without dragging Sunday dinner into it. But outside the courtroom, Hanover couldn't resist. The vampire was one thing. Bloody, violent, almost mythological. But the sausage maker, that struck closer to home. It turned every meal into a gamble, every bite into a potential crime scene. And in the 1920s, when hunger gnawed harder than morality, people admitted, quietly, shamefully, that they might have eaten it and not cared at the time. That's the darkest irony of all. The rumour horrified Hanover not only because it might be true, but because if it was, it had worked. People had eaten, survived another day, and only later realised the cost. Horror disguised as nourishment. Death wrapped up in spice and casing. So, did Haarmann really make sausages from human flesh? No court ever proved it, but the city believed it. And belief in a starving town is almost the same as truth. If Hanover was shocked by the killings, the psychiatric reports were the part that left everyone squirming. Because here, at last, experts were asked the one question that hovers over every monstrous crime. Was he insane? Or just evil? The answer, delivered in the dry prose of men with fountain pens, was as chilling as the crimes themselves. Let's rewind. Haarmann wasn't a stranger to doctors. As early as 1896, decades before the murders, he had already caught the attention of psychiatry. At the age of 17, he was institutionalized briefly after erratic behavior, obsessive outbursts, and what neighbors politely called strangeness. He was released soon after with the vague label of incipient dementia praecox, an old-fashioned term for what today might be filed under schizophrenia spectrum disorder. But then came the contradictions. He enlisted in the military, was discharged for nervous collapse, and spent time in an asylum. Doctors observed delusions, unstable moods, and compulsive lying. Yet each time, he slipped back into the world, armed with new labels, but no treatment. If you read the reports closely, you see the cracks. He was unstable, violent, sexually compulsive, prone to hallucinations. And yet, miraculously, every time the legal system needed him useful, he became fit. Fast forward to the trial in 1924. By then, Haarmann had confessed to dozens of murders, calmly detailing throats bitten, bodies dismembered, bones dumped into the river. His testimony was almost casual, more exasperated than remorseful, like a butcher describing inventory. And into this theatre stepped the psychiatrists, the men tasked with deciding whether Fritz Haarmann was a lunatic or a citizen who knew exactly what he was doing. The first thing they noted: he was articulate, controlled, and oddly polite. He spoke without delusion, described events with precision, and showed no evidence of being out of touch with reality. Translation: no psychosis. That ticked a box. He wasn't raving. He wasn't hallucinating. He wasn't insane in the way the public hoped. But then came the other traits: sudden rages, impulsive violence, compulsive sexuality, sadistic fantasies, emotional shallowness. Today, any competent psychiatrist would start scribbling antisocial personality disorder with comorbid sexual sadism. Some might even stretch into borderline traits or psychopathic spectrum. The coldness, the lack of remorse, the predatory behavior, it fits disturbingly well into the modern profile of a serial killer. What the 1920s experts danced around with words like morally defective and degenerate disposition is what we would now call psychopathy. He wasn't insane. He was frighteningly sane, just wired without the brakes that keep the rest of us from tearing out someone's throat in a burst of rage. One report noted, with a clinical understatement, that Haarmann's sexual impulses cannot be reconciled with moral standards, but he is fully aware of the wrongfulness of his acts. Translation: he liked it. He knew it was illegal, and he did it anyway. That line sealed his fate. Because once you admit someone knows right from wrong, the court doesn't care about why he did it. The law prefers neat categories: insane and not guilty, or sane and guilty. Haarmann fell into the latter, neatly packaged for execution. And yet, reading between the lines, the psychiatric files are almost more horrifying than the murders. They show a man who was clearly disturbed for decades, flagged again and again by doctors, institutions, neighbors, and police. They show a system that repeatedly decided his instability was inconvenient to deal with. They show how easy it was to stamp fit on someone too useful or too much trouble to institutionalize. Today, a man with Haarmann's record, early institutionalization, violent outbursts, predatory behavior toward minors, compulsive lying, mood swings, prior asylum admissions, would never see freedom after his first offenses. He would likely be diagnosed with a combination of antisocial personality disorder, sexual sadism disorder, and possible paraphilic disorders, then monitored indefinitely. Back then, he was set loose again and again until the bodies piled high enough to drown out the excuses. The irony is brutal. The Vampire of Hanover might have been stopped by the very system that later analysed him. Instead, The doctors became historians of horror, chronicling, dissecting, and finally stamping responsible for his actions on a file that reads page after page like a prophecy ignored. So, was Haarmann insane? Number. He was worse. He was a man who understood exactly what he was doing, and did it anyway. Because no one stopped him. Because the system preferred to recycle him. And because in a city where hunger and despair ruled, monsters didn't look out of place. If you ever want a crash course in how not to dispose of human remains, just study the River Lane. Haarmann apparently thought it was the perfect solution. Flowing water, darkness, and a current to carry away the evidence. In his mind, it was nature's conveyor belt, tidying up after him. In reality, it was more like tossing your secrets into the town square and hoping no one noticed. Because the Lena was no wild, anonymous torrent. It was a city river, sluggish in places, shallow in others, and bordered by paths where children played and washerwomen beat clothes against stones. People fished there, for heaven's sake. You couldn't ask for a more public stage. And yet, again and again, Haarmann hauled bones, skulls, and scraps of flesh down to the water, tossed them in, and walked away as if the current would politely erase his sins. The result was inevitable. Kids found skulls while skipping stones. Fishermen pulled up femurs tangled in their nets. Dogs trotted home proudly carrying tibias like chew toys. Hanover quickly learned that a walk along the liner might offer more than fresh air. You might stumble across a jawbone smiling up at you from the mud. At first, the authorities dismissed it. Bones were just bones. After all, this was a city with a bloody past, where soldiers had marched, starved, and sometimes died along the banks. Maybe they were leftovers from the war, maybe medical waste. Excuses sprouted faster than the bodies, and for a while, people convinced themselves that a river full of skeletons was simply one of Hanover's quirky post-war features. But then came the numbers. 1 or 2 bones could be dismissed, dozens could not. By the early 1920s, the Lena had become less a river and more a macabre archive, coughing up fragments at a rate no one could ignore. Skulls with teeth intact, femurs sawed clean, vertebrae gnawed in ways that spoke of human interference rather than time, and all of it, inconveniently, fresh enough to suggest the war was not to blame. The irony is painful. Haarmann, so careful in his flat, so efficient in his killings, was utterly sloppy when it came to disposal. He may have mastered silence behind closed doors, but once he opened them, he handed the city a trail of evidence that a first-year detective could have followed. It wasn't criminal genius, it was criminal arrogance. He thought the city was too blind to notice, and depressingly, he was almost right. For years, the Lena did his dirty work, spitting out bones while Hanover shrugged. People whispered, yes. They gossiped about the vampire, the missing boys, the sausages. But gossip is not evidence, and the police, half in denial and half in league with Haarmann, hesitated to put 2 and 2 together. It took sheer accumulation, pile after pile of bones, to force the obvious. So yes, the Lena was the dumbest hiding place imaginable, but it also tells you something about Hanover in those years. The horror wasn't hidden in the shadows. It was dumped right in front of them, and still they looked away. The bones floated by, and the city let them. By the time Fritz Haarmann finally stood trial in December 1924, Hanover was ready for theatre. Not justice, not closure, theatre. The city that had ignored bones in the river and boys vanishing from the station suddenly discovered its appetite for horror. And the courthouse became the hottest ticket in town. Seats were scarce. Reporters fought for space. Sketch artists sharpened their pencils. and the public lined up as if attending the premiere of a lurid play. Housewives, students, pensioners, they all wanted a glimpse of the monster. Not because they expected revelations, but because nothing spices up cabbage soup like saying, "I saw the vampire myself." The trial itself had all the subtlety of a circus. The prosecution laid out a catalogue of horrors. 24 confirmed murders, boys lured, strangled, bitten, dismembered. Evidence included bones dredged from the liner, clothing identified by relatives, and Haarmann's own chillingly casual confessions. He did not deny the killings. In fact, he seemed almost irritated at having to explain them, as if the court were wasting his time. Witness after witness shuffled in. Neighbours described screams in the night, stains on the stairs, odd smells wafting through the building. Friends recalled Grands strutting in ill-fitting clothes. Policemen admitted awkwardly that Haarmann had been an informant, trusted enough to walk alongside them at the very station where he hunted. The contradictions piled high. How could a man be both predator and policeman's helper? The answer, of course, was incompetence, but the courtroom preferred scandal to shame. And then there was Haarmann himself. He cut an oddly unimpressive figure, short, stocky, balding, with the weary expression of a man waiting for a tram that's running late. He answered questions with blunt honesty, sometimes laced with sarcasm. When pressed about the killings, he shrugged. "Yeah, that one I strangled." When asked about the blood, he quipped, "You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs." The courtroom gasped, and Haarmann smirked. He had become the star of his own grotesque production, and he played the role with unnerving calm. The psychiatric experts were paraded once again, delivering their verdict. Haarmann was not insane. Disturbed, yes. Morally defective, undoubtedly, but fully responsible. He knew right from wrong, and he chose wrong. That was all the court needed to hear. The vampire might fascinate the public, but the law wanted simplicity. Outside, the newspapers feasted. Headlines screamed about the monster of Hanover, the butcher of boys, the vampire. Illustrations depicted him with dripping fangs, his modest flat transformed into a gothic dungeon. The public lapped it up. For a city that had lived through war, famine, and humiliation, Haarmann's trial was a distraction. A horror story they could consume safely, like a penny dreadful. Never mind that for years, the same public had walked past the station, heard the rumours, and ignored the bones in the river. Now they were spectators, not accomplices. In the end, the verdict was inevitable. Guilty on 24 counts of murder. Sentenced to death by beheading. The courtroom exhaled as if some great weight had been lifted, though what they really felt was relief that the story had an ending. The vampire was no longer a rumour in the night. He was a condemned man awaiting the guillotine. And yet, the trial revealed something darker than the man in the dock. It revealed a city complicit in silence, a police force blinded by convenience, a hunger for scandal stronger than the hunger for truth. The Vampire of Hanover was condemned, yes, but Hanover itself didn't walk away clean. Execution Day, April 15th, 1925. Fritz Haarmann woke not in a dungeon, not in a Gothic castle, but in an ordinary prison cell in Hanover. There was no thunderstorm, no dramatic cape, no blood-red moon, just a man in plain clothes, pacing the floor while guards tried not to meet his eyes. That's the thing about real monsters. When you finally pin them down, they look embarrassingly human. The chosen method was the guillotine. Germany in the 1920s still favoured efficiency in these matters. Quick, clean, mechanical. No gallows theatrics, no drawn-out suffering, just a heavy blade and gravity doing the rest. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The Vampire of Hanover, a man obsessed with throats, would lose his own in the most literal way possible. Witnesses reported he was calm. Too calm. He smoked a cigar that morning, joked with guards, and even remarked that death didn't frighten him. If anything, he seemed relieved. Maybe the weight of his own notoriety had finally become unbearable, or maybe, as some whispered, he simply didn't care anymore. After all, remorse had never been a part of his repertoire. When the time came, he was led into the courtyard. A small crowd had gathered. Officials, journalists, the curious with connections. The guillotine stood ready, an obscene piece of furniture against the grey morning. Haarmann mounted the steps, lay down, and in seconds, it was over. The blade fell, the body twitched, and the head rolled neatly into the waiting basket. The executioner held it up briefly, a grotesque ritual of proof. Yes, Hanover's vampire was dead. No. There would be no miraculous escape, no return from the grave. Just a severed head and a story that would outlive him. But the story didn't end at the guillotine. His brain was removed for study, parceled off to psychiatrists who hoped to find the source of evil under a microscope. Spoiler, they didn't. The organ looked perfectly ordinary, stubbornly refusing to yield the secrets of compulsion and cruelty. Evil, it turned out, doesn't leave tidy fingerprints in grey matter. Hanover, meanwhile, was left with a hangover of horror. People whispered about the sausages they might have eaten, the boys they might have ignored at the station, the bones they might have walked past on the riverbank. The vampire was gone, but the city couldn't quite shake the sense that it had been his accomplice. And then came the myth-making. Newspapers abroad devoured the tale. Germany's Sweeney Todd, the Butcher of Hanover, the vampire. The details blurred, embroidered, grew teeth of their own. The sausage story, the vampire bites, the police complicity, it all became part of the legend. Truth mattered less than atmosphere. What people wanted wasn't accuracy. What they wanted was a story to tell in hushed tones, a bedtime horror to feed their fascination. So, what remains of Fritz Haarmann? Not his bones, they were buried and forgotten. Not his victims, they were too many, too lost, too poorly remembered. What remains is the image, the vampire in the station shadows, the parcels of meat under his arm, the blade that silenced him. He became less a man than a cautionary tale. A tale about hunger and blindness, about how a city can ignore the obvious if it's inconvenient, about how monsters rarely hide in castles. They rent flats with bad plumbing. They shake hands with policemen. They smile too long at boys who should have been safe. Haarmann's last act wasn't his beheading. It was the mirror he held up to Hanover, and by extension, to us. The reflection wasn't flattering. And that, sleepless rabble, was the tale of Fritz Haarmann, the so-called Vampire of Hanover. A man who proved you don't need castles, capes, or garlic to create horror. Just hunger, a shabby flat, and a city willing to look the other way. Grim enough? Yes. Entertaining? Maybe? Comforting? Not at all. But at least you'll sleep tonight knowing the sausages in your fridge are probably what the label says. Probably. Now, the real question is, who should we dissect next? Another forgotten killer, another scandal that history politely swept under the rug. Drop your morbid wish list in the comments. I'll be reading. This is Napmax Sleep Stories. You've been listening to Germany's Vampire. Good night, and sweet dreams.